Well, I'm about ready to kick off a brew day. I'm not sure if this one's gonna work out. So I got my 5-gallon kettle, but I'm hoping I can make 5.5 gallons of wort out of this kettle. Can I do it? Well, this is Brent, and thanks a lot for dropping by Cascade's Homebrew. Yeah, so you heard it right. I'm gonna try to get a full batch to try to fill a 5-gallon keg, but I'm here in my stoves, and I only have this 5-gallon kettle that I fit on my stove. I do brew in the bag, so I'm gonna have to make a couple adaptations for this. So for my American viewers, you know how I like sessional beers, really low ABV beers. We're talking like 5% beers. And for my more international viewers, you know how I like really high ABV beers. I'm talking stuff that's way up there, like 5%. Yeah, I know here in the US, we tend to overdo things. 5, 6, 7, 8, above, they're pretty common. So this one was kind of interesting because I was looking at the style guidelines for an Irish Red. I was actually kind of surprised looking at the guidelines, how low they were. And then I figured, hey, if I'm doing a low gravity beer, maybe I could, finagle a little bit and get a full batch on my stove. I find it's just a lot easier often to brew a batch here in my kitchen. I can fix dinner. I don't have to worry about being outside and the weather and it getting dark. This time of year, actually today, it's a pretty nice day outside. So this time of year, so it's right at the beginning of March, daylight's getting a little bit longer, but it's still going to be dark by the time I would finish up outside. So I got the motivation to do an Irish Red, partially because I had some Imperial Darkness yeast on hand that I wanted to use up, partially because St. Patrick's Day coming up. I procrastinated enough, so this one probably won't be ready by St. Patty's Day, which I think is a week and a half away. But I figure anyways, having a 5-gallon batch of kind of a lower ABV, malty, flavorful beer on tap would be a great idea. Well, let me jump over to the computer. We'll take a little bit look at the recipe and see how I scaled it and some of the changes that I made to try to adapt it into my process to be able to fit a 5-gallon batch onto my stove in my 5-gallon kettle and hopefully end up with 5.5 gallons of finished wort into the fermenter. So here I am in Beersmith Web. So I started off by creating the recipe as a 5-gallon. So here we have the Irish Red 5 gallons. Note, I'm going with a 30-minute boil by default. So the recipe was formulated around a 75% efficiency. I kind of went that way and then I targeted it toward the high end of the gravity scale, thinking I probably would not get a 75% efficiency. Well, it ended up turning out, I did hint at this 1046. Well, that was fine. I guess I figured I wanted to go on the high end, because then if I came in low, that would be okay. But if I ended up hitting right on my target, that would be fine as well. So I entered in the grain bill that I thought I would want. So I went around 91% of a Maris Otter from Crisp, an English Pale Ale. I went around 7%, just under 7% of a Crystal 40, and then 2.2% of a roasted barley. The idea of the roasted barley is just a little bit of roasted barley will give you a nice color and a little bit of a red hue. So a note I would have for you if you're formulating your recipe, I know roasted barley can vary quite a bit in Lovibond, so you might want to just check that. I'm using one that's a 480 Lovibond. So for the hops on this, I debated a little bit about my strategy. So I'm using East Kent Goldings, a good classic English hop. So one option would have split it up, kind of a bittering and a flavor addition. But I kind of figured since I had a 30-minute boil, I would just add one addition and that would give me the bittering and maybe a little bit of residual flavor. So I added 1.6 or 45 grams of East Kent Golding to give me about 23 IBUs. So as far as some of the other settings on it, my mash is a fairly typical 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68 degrees Celsius. Carbonation, I'm going to keg this one. A fermentation schedule, again, it's kind of my typical ale schedule. In this case, I'm starting at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 19 degrees Celsius, and then I'll raise it a few degrees after fermentation starts to slow. So as far as the water profile for this recipe, no, I'm starting off with my tap water, which already has a mineral load in it, so I need to account for that. So basically, I'm adding enough gypsum and calcium chloride to boost up my calcium, my sulfate, and my chloride, all to around 50 each. So I got 45, 50, 52. So that's a nice balanced profile, which I think would be a good fit for this beer. So as far as the mash, we'll dig into some changes. Initially it's set for a full volume, brew in the bag. Add a little bit of lactic acid to lower the pH. So now that we have the basics for our full-size recipe that's targeting 5 gallons into the keg or 5.5 gallons into the fermenter, let me go ahead and save this off and then we'll work on converting it. Since I know I can't fit this volume into my 5-gallon kettle, there's a couple changes that I know I want to make. So one, I think we're going to have to add in a sparge step to kind of increase the efficiency, increase the volume for the boil. But then I'm also going to have to top up into the fermenter with some water. So I'm going in this with the assumption that doing that top up, that's probably going to lower my efficiency down. So let me go ahead and first change the efficiency to 70. So that would bring my original gravity potentially down into 1043, which is about where I'd want it to be. Like I mentioned, I did actually come in a little higher on that, but we'll go ahead with the 70% efficiency. So the first change we'll make is adding that top-up water. This is water that's going to be added after the boil. So I go ahead and I edit my equipment profile. And right here, there's a field top-up water. So right now it's set at 0. So we'll go ahead and change that to 2 gallons. So if you notice, that lowered the boil volume down to 4.4. When we didn't have anything in there, it was 6.5 gallons of boil volume, which I know I can't do that in a 5-gallon kettle. So we'll go to 2 gallons of top-up water, and we'll save that. The next thing you know we want to add is a sparge step. So in Beersmith, we switch over to the mash tab. So the first thing we want to do is go ahead and edit our mash profile. So in this case, I already have it set as a brew in the bag full volume mash. So we're not doing the full volume mash, so we'll go ahead and uncheck that. So we'll go ahead and tell Beersmith we're going to do a batch sparge. That's basically what we're doing. They'll use equal batches. It doesn't matter in our case. I think that's more in use when you've got a lot of sparge water and you may need to do more than one step. Drain mash them before sparge. That's fine because that's essentially what we're doing. We're not really draining the ton. We're removing the grain, which essentially is the same thing. So now we've got that switched over. We'll go ahead and click OK. Next thing we want to do is change our mash step. So in this case, we're telling them we want to add 5 gallons to the mash. And I know I can't fit 5 gallons plus the grain into my 5-gallon kettle. So I kind of figure that I want to probably hold back about 1.25, so 1.25 gallons. So if we subtract our 1.25 gallons from our 5.04 gallons predicted, that would be 3.79. Well, we can't measure in that kind of precision. So we'll go ahead and 3.8 gallons we'll enter. So that'll be the water that we'll add to the mash. And when we do that, you'll see now it added 1.24 gallons as a sparge step. So that sounds like it's pretty good. So I note with the tweaks of the mash, it changed a little bit of the pH prediction. So the way Beersmith works, you take the unadjusted mash, so 5.64, we'll add that into our measured mash pH. We'll paste that in. And now it's saying we need 2 milliliters of lactic acid in the mash, and then we need 0.5 milliliters into the sparge. Yeah, I think we're just going to ignore the sparge amount. We'll go ahead and adjust this to 2. So there we go. So now we have a recipe that's ready for our concentrated boil. So the steps we're going to do our initial mash, then we're going to do a sparge step, and then after the boil, we're going to add 2 gallons into the fermenter. So hopefully if I've tweaked everything right, we'll hit our volume. We'll end up with 5.5 gallons, or right around 21 liters, into the fermenter. All right, so now it's time to brew the beer. So as I get into the brew day, I want to focus a little bit more about the process than the specific recipe. So I'm brewing an Irish Red today. It did turn out quite nice. I actually won a bronze in a local competition. So I'm thinking I might brew another Irish Red again soon. Make this one the second in my series Road to Gold, where I take a recipe, try to win some medals with it. But I think the most interesting thing about this batch is I'm using brew in the bag on my stovetop in a 5-gallon kettle and producing a full 5-gallon keg of finished beer. In this case, it's going to be a low gravity beer, but I think this process would work well for, say, an original gravity 1040, 1050. So that would give you a 4-5% ABV beer. So I'm not 100% sure if it's needed, but the night before I prepped my top-up water. So this is the water that's going to be added directly into the fermenter along with the chilled wort. So bringing it up to a boil, well, that should help kill off maybe any bacteria that happens to be in the water. Again, using tap water, it might be fine. Using spring water, distilled, RO, some kind of bottled water, that should be fine well. I think I might have used my filter to remove any chlorine and chloramine that's in my tap water. So on brew day, I measure out the total water that I'm going to need for both the mash and the sparge. I'm sure to treat it with Campton tablet to remove any of the chlorine and chloramines from my tap water. I then set aside the water they're going to need for the sparge. The mash water gets a little bit of lactic acid to lower the pH, and also gets some calcium chloride and some gypsum to adjust the mineral levels. My target mash temperature was 154 degrees Fahrenheit, or 68 degrees Celsius. I come in just below that, 152 degrees Fahrenheit, 67 degrees Celsius. That's fine with me. That should give me pretty much the exact final result. At the end of the 60-minute mash, I always move my kettle over here to my sink. I always find I always get a little bit of dripping when I pull out the grain bag. This is the best way here in my kitchen with my wooden floors to kind of maintain any kind of mess. For a typical 2.5 gallon, around 10 liter batch, I usually do a full volume mash. That means I'm using the full amount of the water in the mash. In this case, to help boost up both the amount and the gravity, I'm going to do a sparge. In this case, I'm doing a dunk sparge. It's very similar to a batch sparge. The first step is remove the grain bag and then squeeze out a reasonable amount of the liquid in there. So these first runnings are put into the kettle and then I start heating it up to a boil. I then moved the grain bag into the bucket and then I added my sparge water. In this case, I heated up the sparge water, but I've tried room temperature. I'm not sure it makes much difference. After adding the water, I give the grain and the water a good stir. Then I let it rest for 10 minutes, come back, give it another good stir, and then I do my squeezing, removing the liquid process again. Second runnings are then added into the kettle. My goal is 4.4 gallons or 16.7 liters at 1056. So I come in really close with the volume, 4.5 gallons or 17 liters, but I got several extra points of gravity, so I measured 1064. The start of the boil, I added my single hop edition of East Kent Goldings. So note, if you're doing this at home, make sure you keep an eye as the wort comes up to a boil to avoid a boil over. It really can happen quick and it makes a big mess. So with this limited amount of headspace, you really got to keep an eye out for it. So I do find that even with this increased volume, my gas stove is able to keep a pretty decent boil going. So your stove is a little underpowered. You may have to take that into consideration when you think how much volume you can boil. With 10 minutes left in the boil, I add in some yeast nutrient and a Werflock tablet. At the end of the boil, I check my volume. I'm just a touch over 4 gallons, which is right about 1/10 of a gallon above my target. Overall, I'm on target with my volumes, and again, a few more points of gravity. I do find an inexpensive refractometer is really handy for taking gravity readings on brew day. And as standard, I transfer the kettle over my sink and use my immersion chiller to chill down to pitching temperatures. I then transfer the chilled wort into my fermenter. I find that this coarse strainer does a good job of filtering out most of the hop particles. It should also help a little bit with aerating the wort. So double check to have right around 3.5 gallons of wort. I take a gravity reading and measured around 1075. I then added my 2 gallons of top-up water to bring my target of 5.5 gallons in the fermenter. I did not mess with taking another gravity reading after I diluted the wort. I wrote down original gravity, 1046, but doing some calculations here, it really might have been 1048 or so. So if you're interested in how to do those calculations, a simple way is just to calculate gravity points. In this case, 3.5 gallons at 1075, well that gives me 262.5 gravity points. If we divide that in 5.5, that would give us 48 gravity points or 1048 final gravity. I got the numbers here in metric as well, so the same kind of calculations apply. I'm using 1 pack of Imperial A10 Darkness. The pack's a bit old. I probably should have made a starter just to kickstart it. I kind of figured that the large cell count of Imperial packs and the lower gravity of this beer would be fine. At this point, I know I probably should have added the top-up water after removing the fermenter down to my lower level, so I wouldn't have to carry the full volume. Lesson learned. So fermentation is a little slow to get started. Again, probably that old pack of yeast, but by day 2, I've got a good head of krausen. Fermentation is underway. Then 11 days in, I determine the beer is ready and move it into a keg. I measure a final gravity of 1013, which puts me at 4.3%. That's a good ABV. So if I use that 1048 original gravity that I calculated, that would put me at 4.6%. So in my book, either of those ABVs is a fine target for this style. So do I have any thoughts about the process? Well, yeah, overall I'm kind of excited about the idea of making larger sized batches in my kitchen on my stove with a fairly easy process. Like I mentioned, it's usually just a little bit easier for me to fit in my kitchen just kind of after work while don't have to worry about the weather and whether it's dark outside. This process would work pretty good for lower gravity beers. Again, I mentioned probably that 1040, 1050. A little above that might be pushing it, but it could easily do, say, a 3.5, 4 gallon batch. I think that 3.5, 4 gallon batch might be a great size for fermenting in a keg, a 5 gallon keg. If you recall from my recent West Coast Pilsner that I fermented in a keg with Nova Lager, I did 3.5 gallons of wort in the keg, and that worked out really well. Is there a downside to making those full-size batches? Well, if you're like me, I often find about 2-3 gallons into a keg, and I'm starting to get a little bored of it, ready to move on. The Irish Red did take a little while to kick, but it was kind of nice being able to take a growler or two to different events and share it with friends. All right, so how did the beer taste out? Let's go ahead and crack open a bottle. So there's the beer. This is a bottle that was filled off the keg a little while ago. I'm a little behind on filming some videos, so even though this one was in the keg for a while, I didn't get around to filming this until just now. So the appearance on it, it's definitely maybe a little bit darker than I wanted, but it's got a nice kind of ruby red color that you can see through the light. What about the aroma? Got a nice, I get a little bit of maybe that spicy hop character from that, maybe the East Kent Goldings. It could be that it's a little, maybe a fermentation flaw. I don't know, a little bit of fruitiness from that. Smells nice. I get a little bit of maltiness, a little bit of sweetness, maybe a little bit of fruitiness, a little bit, maybe some earthy hop character. The taste on it, quite nice beer. Got just a little touch of a roast character, a little bit of a fruitiness hanging around. I think the the roasted barley gives a little bit of color, but I think also important of this style is just that little touch of kind of some roast character in there. So overall, I would say, for being a while since I brewed an Irish Red, I think this one turned out really well. My basic idea was really trying to simplify the grain bill, not using anything like really complicated to try to give, grainy characters or color to it. I don't think those are really needed for an Irish Red. I think this one turned out quite nice. So as I mentioned, I put this one in a local competition. It's kind of a smaller competition, but it won a bronze medal in the Pale British and Irish beer category. Scored an overall score of a 32 with sort of this inappropriate kind of hop spicy character was maybe the biggest thing that I heard as far as feedback. I could see maybe a little bit of that. Like I said, it could be maybe a fermentation flaw, maybe like, just not pitching enough yeast, but still a really nice tasting beer. And then also, I did a side-by-side with O'Hare's and Smithwick's. The color on 3 was actually really identical. I thought mine was a little too dark, but actually it's almost the same as those. I thought the O'Hare's maybe a bit caramely heavy. It could have been an old bottle. I think the Smithwick's, maybe I liked it just a little touch better than mine. There's just a little kind of a cleaner taste, but I think both were very similar. They're kind of in the same ballpark. It could just be a preference at that point. Like I said, I don't want to go too deep into this particular recipe. So what are things that I might change? One, maybe I'll address the hoppiness. Does it have an inappropriate, was adding all of that just at a 30-minute, did that leave too much hop flavor? And I'm not sure. So I could change it, 60-minute boil, or I could use maybe a neutral bittering hop and then a small charge at the end. I'll have to think about that. I probably want to move the original gravity down a little bit, back to my target, just to remove the ABV a little bit. And then personally, I think I like a little bit lighter color, so I might lower the roasted barley just a touch, just to remove that down a little bit. And then if I was using an older yeast packet like that, I would make sure to use a starter, make sure I have a good vigorous fermentation. So in case there were any fermentation flaws in this, it would get rid of those. So what about you brewing the bag? What size batches do you find that you can get out of a kettle? A lot of people say you need a kettle 3 times the size. For the longest time, I did one that's about twice the size. I think twice the size is a great. But if you can squeeze out with a little bit of work, adding a sparge, in this case, lower gravity with a top up, I think it adds a bit of flexibility into your brew schedule. So if you try anything like this, make sure you let me know. And also, as I mentioned, I hope to cycle back to Irish Red as part of my Road to Gold series. I'll try to get a recipe, dig into it, brew it a few times, and then see if I can get some medals in a competition. So if that kind of stuff is interesting for you, make sure you subscribe. So hope to see you again soon. Cheers.